Hi, I'm Ted Fay, and I like finding history. It can be in a museum, a hotel, a park, inside or outside, in a church, a house, a store, and of course old buildings and even ghost towns. Wherever there were people, they made history. So I've set out to find those cool places and things that have a great past. Just think of me as your history delivery guy, who brings you new and fresh servings of history to go. Central Nevada was the site of the last great gold rush on the western frontier. From 1900 to 1910, thousands came from around the world seeking riches in this barren desert. I headed out to one of Nevada's most famous ghost towns, Goldfield, to meet with a descendant of an original gold rush family. This man would bring a perspective to the story that few can. Gold was in his blood.
Allan Metscher, born July 5, 1945, in the Tonopah Miners Hospital, as it was called at the time.
And where do you live now?
Goldfield. My connection with Goldfield started in Neuenwalde, Germany. My grandfather, Bernhard Johann Hendrik Metscher, and his brother immigrated over to this country and landed at Ellis Island.
Ellis Island in New York was the first stop for anyone immigrating to the United States. But for these brothers, it certainly wasn't the last. Somehow, they had heard about the riches in Nevada. By the time they had landed in New York, the story of the huge 1900 silver strike in Tonopah was heard around the world. Then just 20 miles south, near a mountain with a hooked peak, came a grand gold strike. And there was only one reason the brothers headed west.
Gold, that was what they were looking for, was gold. And thus the term gold fever, and it was almost like a sickness to them. They went to work in the mines up at Virginia City, Candelaria, all of the mining camps of that era. After traveling around the state of Nevada, my grandfather finally settled in Columbia. Yes.
Okay.
My grandfather.
The Goldfield strike in 1902 started a gold rush, and the mountain with the hooked peak was eventually named by a Nevada mining engineer. It was called Columbia Mountain, and near its base grew the settlement of Columbia.
Which way did the town go?
Columbia was first. When he settled here, his residence was a converted chicken coop. It was pretty tough going now, and you had to settle for what you could get. He married my grandma, who was from Brooklyn, and brought her out to Goldfield. By 1908, she was pregnant. My dad was born, and so I'm sure they built some additions on. And 2 years later, she was pregnant again. My uncle was born. They were prepared to start a family here in Columbia.
Columbia was one of the first suburbs of Goldfield, established only 4 months after Goldfield itself, in February 1904.
Columbia was a rough and tumble town too at the time. Several hundred people down there before the growth of Goldfield. And shootings on the main street, robberies, just what you'd have in any camp or city today. But you had dance halls too, and a church down there. Columbia had its own newspaper, post office. You can safely say it was connected to the outside world.
So Allan and I are out here on a bit of a precarious little ledge here, which is at the edge of a open pit that was done some years later, right, Allan?
Yes, within the last 25 years or so.
Within the last 25 years, and but we're in the hub of what was really the mining activity right here in Goldfield.
Right here, the richest deposits, the most taken out right in this area.
Right, and your family was here, right? Where was your family's mine, your dad and your grandfather's mine at?
Well, we look over in that direction, you see two poles sticking up in the support posts lean down. That's the remains of the combination fractions head frame.
Okay.
Yeah, right, that's right over the shaft. That's where my dad and uncle mined in the 20s and then in the 30s and even again in the 40s.
Wow. So, Allan, where are we right here?
Okay, we're standing on what used to be a spur line from the depot for the train to wind around, go up the gully there to the Tonopah Goldfield Railroad shops for when repairs were needed.
And this was part of the Tonopah Goldfield?
This was, it ran from Mina, Nevada to Goldfield.
Very, very, very interesting. Now, look, there's,
notice
this, there's some stuff on the ground here. And what is this exactly?
That plate is where the rail the trains ran on would run between there and had spikes in it. They spike into the railroad ties, the wooden ties, in order to keep the rail down in one place so it wouldn't spread when the trains went over it.
So this little bit of railroad history is still here then?
Been here for over 100 years.
That's amazing. This plate, basically you got bolts in it here, I guess.
Spikes.
The spikes, and it would hold down the rail lines. Incredible. Here, after all these years, still here, and it's hot. It's really, really hot because it's hot outside.
My grandfather, working in various mines anywhere he could get a job, one of the many places was the Mohawk mine. That was a rich one too. Between 1906 and 1909, that produced over $9 million worth of gold. And that was when gold was only $20.67 an ounce or thereabouts. So that was a lot of ounces of gold. But he, when working at the Mohawk mine, he was injured. And as time went on, he developed other problems because of that injury. And it finally got to the point where my grandmother, in order to feed the kids and him, she went to work as a maid up in the Goldfield Hotel.
The Goldfield Hotel opened in 1908 and was touted as the grandest place to stay between Denver and San Francisco. But it has been rumored to be one of America's most haunted places. And perhaps Allan's grandmother had the first encounter.
She'd go up in the mornings and begin her duties one floor at a time, cleaning the rooms. And one morning, she went up, got her cleaning supplies out, walked down the hallway. Mr. Finley, hotel employee, maintenance man, his door was open. And as she walked by it, he was standing in there, as she told it to us. And said to him, "Good morning, Mr. Finley," and he nodded his head up and down. And later on, when she finished her duties, she was talking with the desk clerk of the hotel, and he said, "Geez, too bad about Finley, isn't it?" And my grandma said, "What do you mean? Saw him a little while ago, he seemed okay to me." And said, the desk clerk said, "Well, you couldn't have. He committed suicide last night." And that story she told to me and my brothers when we were kids, but she's told exactly the same one to my dad and uncle when it happened in 1914. So what she saw or what she thought she saw, who knows? And the ironic thing about it, Finley's grave is about 4 graves away from my grandfather's grave out here at the Goldfield Cemetery. As far as how well they did in the mines, the 2 generations, my grandfather and these 2 boys, none of them died rich, I'll put it that way. Now my grandfather, he died of the mine injuries eventually, left the widow and 2 little boys destitute. Those 2 little boys, my dad and uncle, they grew up, they had gold fever too, just like their father did. The mining killed those 2 too, my dad and uncle. They both passed away because silicosis, dust in the lungs. The silica in the dust ate up their lung tissue. And so 2 more victims of gold fever. And basically, the ones that got rich were the mine owners. not the miners and muckers and timbermen and all that were making $3 and $4 a day.
As Goldfield's fortunes began to fall, crimes of robbery began to rise. One type of thievery that was at first ignored, but later was prosecuted, was miners pocketing small amounts of gold from the mines and taking it home.
The term high grading is actually stealing high-grade ore from the company. When a blast would open up a vein down in a company's shaft, high grading was quite prevalent. Sticking the gold, vein gold in your shoes, in your socks, in your pockets, until the companies instituted change rooms. You could hardly blame them making $3, $4 a day while the company owners were getting rich. But at that time, Goldfield had over 20 assay offices, and it's been shown over the years only approximately 3 or 4 of them were legitimate ones. All the others were buying at a discounted price from the high graders that gold ore and reselling it at a much higher price. The demise of Goldfield and the slowdown, initially it began with all the union troubles here. A lot of people left looking for greener pastures, even though many had hoped to come back in later years. And a flood, September 13th, 1913, they had a flood here in Goldfield. And a deluge of water came down on the west side and the east side and took out a lot of the low-lying businesses and did massive damage to the railroad shops and depots on the north end of Goldfield. Yeah, my dad talked about the 1913 flood. He was still a boy, but he remembered the deluges of water coming down. Afterwards, walking up and down the different gullies that the deluges came down and seeing stoves and even a few safes were washed out of businesses up and down the gullies there. And still stories afloat that different companies' safes have washed away, supposedly full of gold, have never been recovered. Somewhere out there. As time went on, even though the mines were still producing somewhat, nothing like 1906, 1907, 1908, but they were still producing. And the fire of 1923 came, and 22 approximately city blocks wiped out completely. Initially, they thought a whiskey still blew up. It was during Prohibition. The whiskey still blew up right across Columbia Street from the Goldfield Hotel. Many of the buildings, and even a few, had signs on them, completely fireproof. By the next morning, they were just hulks of walls and collapsed ceiling roofs. But the lucky thing is, only 2 or 3 casualties. And the same with the Goldfield flood, 3 casualties. So in that respect, wasn't that disastrous, other than for the future of Goldfield it was, whereas a lot of people never returned, and with the gold production declining by then.
Stories like those of the Metscher family are golden memories. Allan, like his father and grandfather, may have just a touch of the gold fever, though his is for preserving his treasure of memories in the story of this gold rush family.